The days leading up to my baby shower were filled with a mixture of excitement, nerves, and the kind of anticipation that only comes when you are about to experience a milestone you have dreamed about for years. Becoming a mother had always felt like something far off in the distance, something I admired when I saw it happening to others, but now it was finally my turn. I had carefully circled the date on my calendar months ago, and every day closer brought me more joy as well as a growing sense of responsibility. It wasn't just a party, it was the moment where my loved ones would come together to celebrate not just my baby, but the journey I was stepping into as a mother. I wanted everything to feel right, from the decorations to the food, because this was more than just an event. It was a memory I wanted to hold on to forever. Planning it became a way for me to pour all of my love and excitement into something tangible. I spent hours scrolling through ideas online, debating between soft pastels or a brighter theme, finally choosing colors that felt warm and welcoming. I remember standing in the middle of the store, holding tiny decorations in my hands, imagining how they would look on the tables and around the room. Every little detail mattered to me. I wanted the people who came to feel the love and happiness that I was carrying inside me for my child. My friends laughed when I obsessed over which cake design to pick, but I knew it wasn't just about cake. It was about creating an atmosphere where the joy of new beginnings could be shared by everyone in the room. When the day finally arrived, I could hardly sleep the night before. I woke up early, too restless to stay in bed, and started getting ready hours before anyone else would arrive. I wanted to look my best, not out of vanity, but because I wanted to feel beautiful in this moment where my body was already carrying so much change. Standing in front of the mirror, I placed my hands gently on my belly and thought about how one day my child would hear this story. I wanted to be able to tell them how loved they were before they even entered the world, how much effort went into celebrating their existence before their first breath was ever taken. That thought alone made me smile, and it gave me a kind of calm that no amount of stress or planning could shake. As the first guests arrived, I felt my heart lift. Seeing familiar faces walk in with smiles, carrying little bags wrapped in colorful paper and tied with ribbons, made me realize how lucky I was to have so many people supporting me. The sound of laughter began to fill the room, and with it came the sense of warmth I had been hoping for. Friends hugged me, relatives patted my shoulder, and everyone seemed genuinely happy to be there. I watched as people admired the decorations, complimenting the choices I had made, and it felt like all my effort was being noticed. In those first few moments, everything felt perfect, like the day was unfolding exactly how I had envisioned it. I remember walking around the room, talking to everyone, feeling like the center of attention, but not in a selfish way, in a way that reminded me that this was my moment, my child's moment, our family's moment. The gifts piled up on the table, the food looked delicious, and even the soft background music added to the atmosphere I had hoped for. Every time someone placed their hand on my belly or asked about the baby's kicks, I felt seen and celebrated in a way that is hard to put into words. It wasn't just about the baby shower, it was about the recognition that I was entering a new chapter of life, one that was sacred and personal, and yet also something that everyone in the room could share in. For a while, I let myself bask in that happiness, feeling the culmination of months of preparation come together in a room filled with love. The decorations glowed softly under the lights, the laughter around me was genuine, and there was this sense of harmony that made me feel secure. I thought to myself that this was the kind of day I would never forget, that when I looked back years later, I would remember how special it felt to be surrounded by people who wanted to share in my joy. The emotional significance of that day for me went far beyond the decorations, the cake, or the small details that had consumed so much of my attention in the weeks before. Deep inside, I understood that this baby shower was not just an event, it was a symbolic passage into a new role that would redefine me in ways I couldn't yet imagine. Standing there, with my hands resting on my stomach, I felt the weight of all the changes that had already begun. My body was different, my emotions were different, and my priorities were shifting toward someone I hadn't even met yet, but already loved with an intensity that was impossible to explain. Every smile directed at me, every hand that reached out to touch my belly, and every kind word spoken by my guests seemed to recognize that transformation. It was as if the entire room was acknowledging not just the baby who would arrive, but the woman I was becoming because of them. For me, the baby shower carried layers of meaning that perhaps not everyone could see on the surface. To others, it might have looked like a festive gathering with balloons, food, and gifts, but to me it was about being seen as a mother for the first time. It was about my family and friends recognizing that my life was about to change forever. I had been someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone's friend, someone's partner, but this day marked the beginning of being someone's mother. That realization brought tears to my eyes more than once, and I had to excuse myself to the side of the room just to take a deep breath and let the wave of emotions settle before I could rejoin the conversations. I thought about all the stories I had heard from other mothers, their struggles, their sacrifices, and their joys. Many had told me that pregnancy was not easy, that the journey could be exhausting and at times overwhelming, and I had certainly felt those truths in the months leading up to this day. The morning sickness, the endless doctor's appointments, the nights when I couldn't sleep because no position felt comfortable, those moments had tested me. Yet, standing there at my shower, I felt a strange sense of pride. Those difficulties were proof that I was already doing the work of motherhood, already enduring for the sake of someone else, someone who hadn't even opened their eyes yet. The celebration made those struggles feel lighter, as though they were all part of a path leading me to this moment of recognition. There was also a deeper, quieter significance that I kept close to my heart. Having this baby felt like a chance to break cycles, to give my child things I never had, to pour into them a kind of love and stability that I sometimes longed for when I was younger. As I watched relatives gather around me, clapping and laughing, I thought about how my child would grow up surrounded by these very people, and how I wanted them to feel secure in that love. The baby shower became more than a party, it was a promise. A promise to myself that I would do everything in my power to create a safe and joyful world for the little one inside me, no matter what sacrifices that required. What made the day even more emotional was the way small moments carried so much weight. When a close friend hugged me and whispered that I was going to be a wonderful mother, I felt something stir deep inside me. When an older relative shared a story about her own first child and how she had cried the first time she held them, I couldn't stop myself from imagining the moment I would cradle my baby for the first time. Every story, every gesture, every shared smile layered more meaning onto the day, making it feel like a tapestry of love and hope woven together in honor of a future I was stepping into. Even the gifts, though material, carried significance. Each tiny outfit, each soft blanket, each pack of diapers reminded me that others were preparing alongside me, that they too were investing in the life that was about to begin. Every wrapped present seemed to whisper encouragement. You are not alone, you are supported, you are stepping into something bigger than yourself. The emotional weight of that realization was almost too much at times, and I found myself blinking back tears as I carefully unwrapped each one, holding it as though it was more than an item, it was a gesture of love. The room was filled with laughter and conversation, yet underneath it all I felt this steady hum of something sacred. This wasn't just about celebrating me, it was about welcoming the child who had already transformed so much of my world. The emotional significance of the day settled deep into my heart, wrapping itself around me in ways I knew I would carry long after the decorations came down and the guests went home. Just when I thought the day was flowing exactly how I had imagined, my brother stood up, his voice carrying over the soft music and the chatter of guests. At first, I didn't think much of it. He had always been the kind to crack jokes or grab everyone's attention whenever he felt the room needed it. People paused mid-conversation, eyes shifting toward him, expecting some light-hearted remark or maybe a toast for me. I smiled politely, assuming he was going to say something supportive about me becoming a mother, maybe share a story from our childhood that would make everyone laugh. But the words that came out of his mouth took me completely by surprise. With a grin stretching across his face, he proudly announced that he had just been accepted into Stanford. The room erupted in cheers, claps, and gasps of delight. I heard people shout congratulations and saw relatives rush toward him, surrounding him with hugs. The excitement was immediate and intense, like a spark had been lit in the middle of the room. My heart skipped, not out of joy, but because I suddenly felt a shift. The energy I had carefully curated for my baby shower, the warmth, the focus, the celebration of this new chapter of my life, tilted sharply in another direction. I sat there, hands still resting on my belly, smiling stiffly, trying to process what had just happened. I understood the weight of what he had shared. Getting into Stanford was no small feat. It was something to be proud of, something worth celebrating. Part of me was genuinely happy for him. After all, I knew how hard he had worked, how many hours he had spent studying late into the night. I knew the sacrifices he had made, and I wasn't blind to the significance of this achievement. But the timing on my day, during my baby shower, made it difficult to swallow that joy without feeling a sting of hurt beneath it. What struck me most was how quickly the room's focus changed. Moments ago, people had been asking me about the baby's kicks, about names I was considering, about how I was feeling. Now, those same people were crowded around my brother, asking about his program, about when he would move, about what this meant for his future. The decorations, the cake, the tiny outfits neatly stacked on the table, all the things that had symbolized the heart of the day, suddenly felt like props in the background of a scene that was no longer mine. I sat there, still smiling, nodding at people who glanced in my direction, but inside, I felt smaller and smaller. I watched as guests took out their phones, eager to take pictures with him, capturing his moment of triumph. Laughter and cheers echoed across the room, and I couldn't help but notice how my carefully chosen playlist was drowned out by the chorus of congratulations directed entirely at him. Even the conversations that returned to me felt half-hearted, as though people were eager to pivot back to the more exciting news. It was as if my baby, my journey, my moment had been placed on hold, overshadowed by something they considered bigger, brighter, more worthy of attention. I kept telling myself to stay calm, to not let bitterness creep into my heart. After all, he was my brother, and I loved him. I wanted to be proud of him, and I was. But it was impossible not to notice the imbalance, impossible not to feel the ache of being sidelined in a celebration that was supposed to honor me and the life growing inside me. I forced a laugh when someone joked that now we had 2 reasons to celebrate. I nodded politely when someone suggested we should toast to him. But inside, I felt like I was slowly fading into the background of my own story. As the minutes stretched on, I found myself torn between emotions. Part of me wanted to stand up, to remind everyone why we had gathered in the first place, to pull the attention gently back to the baby shower. Another part of me stayed rooted to my chair, unwilling to make a scene, not wanting to look petty or selfish for resenting the spotlight being shifted. I sat there with a polite smile that hid the conflict swirling inside me, pride for my brother, but disappointment for myself. Even as I glanced around the room, I noticed how easily people had forgotten the atmosphere I had worked so hard to create. The pastel colors, the themed decorations, the soft glow of the candles, they were all still there, yet they seemed invisible now. The narrative of the day had changed, and I was left silently clutching my belly, whispering to myself that this was supposed to be about the baby. This was supposed to be about me stepping into motherhood. And now, somehow, it wasn't. The moment my brother made his announcement, I felt the atmosphere shift like a wave crashing over everything I had planned for. It wasn't that anyone deliberately meant harm or that his achievement wasn't worth celebrating, but the way attention moved so quickly away from me left me stunned. I watched as relatives gathered around him with shining eyes, peppering him with questions, clapping his back, and pulling him into hugs. My baby shower, which had been filled with warm conversations about motherhood, gentle laughter, and anticipation for the baby, suddenly took on the tone of a victory party for him. The energy in the room was unmistakable, and I couldn't stop myself from feeling that my moment was slipping away, replaced by his success. Even the way people carried themselves changed. The gifts for me sat unopened on the table, neatly stacked with colorful ribbons, but they were pushed aside as more and more people shifted their focus to him. The cake that I had spent so long choosing, a centerpiece of the event, was momentarily forgotten as relatives huddled together to talk about scholarships, future plans, and how proud the family must be. Aunts and uncles who had earlier been asking me about baby names were now asking him which professors he hoped to study under. Friends who had been taking pictures of the decorations now turned their cameras toward him, capturing candid shots of his glowing smile and animated gestures as he retold how he had received the acceptance letter. It wasn't just about the celebration, it was about the way the dynamic of the room tilted completely. I tried to stay gracious, nodding and smiling when people occasionally remembered to include me, but I couldn't shake the hollowness I felt inside. It was as though I had become a background character in my own story, quietly holding onto the joy that was supposed to be mine while the spotlight had shifted to someone else entirely. Each time I glanced at the decorations I had so carefully chosen, they seemed almost mocking, reminding me of the effort I had poured into creating this day, only to see it drowned out by a single announcement. I noticed how some of my closest friends tried to bring the attention back to me. A few of them came over, rubbing my belly, asking softly how I was doing, trying to remind me that this was still my day. But their voices were quickly lost in the louder chorus of excitement for him. Even when I tried to rejoin conversations, to steer them back toward the baby, it was like tossing a pebble into a raging river. It was swallowed instantly. Someone would say something kind about me, but then another person would shout across the room, "Hey, tell us more about Stanford," and just like that, the moment would vanish. I felt torn between two worlds. On the outside, I forced myself to appear calm, collected, even supportive. I clapped for him when everyone else did. I offered congratulations. I posed for a picture where I stood beside him, both of us smiling, though mine felt more like a mask than anything genuine. On the inside, though, there was a storm brewing. My emotions swung wildly between love for my brother and resentment for how easily my own joy was being overshadowed. I hated myself for feeling jealous, for even allowing bitterness to creep into what should have been a happy day. But no matter how hard I tried to push it away, I couldn't help but notice the sting each time someone called out his name louder than they had called mine earlier. Even my parents, who had been so attentive to me at the start of the shower, seemed swept up in the tide. I caught glimpses of them beaming at him, their pride radiating so brightly it nearly blinded me. I wanted them to look at me with that same intensity, to share that same pride in the life I was carrying. But in that moment, their joy belonged entirely to him. I told myself it was natural, that parents celebrate every child's success differently, but a small part of me ached at how effortlessly the focus had been shifted. As the room buzzed with conversations about his future, I became quieter. I withdrew into myself, sitting with my hands clasped around my belly, silently reminding myself why I was here. I thought about my baby, about how much love I had already given them, about the nights I had spent dreaming of holding them in my arms. That was supposed to be what today was about, welcoming this child into a circle of love. Instead, it felt like the circle had expanded to fit someone else, and I was being pushed to the edges. I tried to find small pockets of peace throughout the chaos. When a close friend leaned in and whispered, "Don't forget, this is still your day," I smiled gratefully, holding on to her words like a lifeline. When another guest quietly handed me a tiny pair of baby shoes and said she couldn't wait to see my child wear them, I clutched them tightly, drawing comfort from the reminder that not everyone had forgotten. But the truth was, no matter how many small moments I tried to hold on to, the larger picture was clear. My baby shower had changed course, and the spotlight I had imagined shining softly on me and my baby was now directed somewhere else entirely. As the celebration carried on, I began to realize just how much I had been pushed to the sidelines. Every corner of the room seemed to hum with conversations that had nothing to do with me or the baby. People who had earlier been complimenting my glow or asking how far along I was were now eagerly discussing dorm life, career prospects, and the prestige of being accepted into a university like Stanford. I sat there, smiling when eyes flickered in my direction, but I could feel my presence thinning, like I was fading into the background of my own carefully planned day. The spotlight that had once been gently focused on me had shifted completely, and the sting of being overlooked burned quietly inside me. I wanted to speak up, to remind everyone of why we had gathered. This wasn't just a casual get-together, it was my baby shower, an event I had poured months of planning into. I had envisioned laughter centered around the baby, thoughtful conversations about the journey into motherhood, and joyful support from those closest to me. Instead, I found myself sitting quietly while the very people who were supposed to celebrate me were caught up in a whirlwind that had nothing to do with the life growing inside me. Each time I thought the focus might swing back to me, someone would bring up another question for my brother, and the ripple of excitement would spread again, washing over the room and leaving me stranded in silence. What made it harder was how natural it seemed for everyone else. They didn't seem to notice the shift, didn't see how drastically the day had changed. They laughed and cheered, their voices rising with energy, while I forced myself to join in with a chuckle here, a clap there, even though inside I was wilting. I kept telling myself not to be selfish, not to let jealousy ruin the joy of someone else's achievement, especially someone I loved. But it was impossible not to feel the ache of being overshadowed, the quiet devastation of watching a day that was meant for me turn into something else entirely. There were moments when I felt invisible, as though I was just another guest at my own party. I noticed how people drifted away from the gift table, how the decorations I had worked so hard on became nothing more than a backdrop for his photos, how even the cake was cut with his achievement in mind rather than the celebration of my baby. I forced myself to hold on to polite smiles, but behind them was a growing sadness. This was supposed to be my milestone, my moment of recognition, and yet I found myself applauding someone else's milestone instead. I thought about the symbolism of it all, how often women's experiences, especially around motherhood, are overshadowed or minimized compared to other achievements. It wasn't just about this one day, it was about what it represented. I was carrying life inside me, preparing for a role that would demand everything from me, and yet that felt smaller in everyone's eyes than an academic acceptance letter. I couldn't help but question why my journey seemed less significant, why people couldn't hold both celebrations without letting one eclipse the other. The sidelining became even more apparent when I noticed my parents. At the beginning of the shower, they had been so attentive, hovering near me, checking that I was comfortable, sharing stories about my own childhood with the guests. But now their faces glowed with pride for my brother, their voices animated as they recounted his dedication, their bodies leaning toward him as though he was the center of gravity in the room. I didn't resent their pride, I understood it, but I couldn't ignore how quickly their focus had shifted away from me. The absence of that same pride directed at me, for carrying their grandchild, left an emptiness that gnawed at me quietly. I found myself shrinking into smaller spaces, clutching at fleeting moments of kindness. A friend who gently asked if I was tired, a relative who pressed a hand against my belly and whispered that the baby was lucky to have me. These small gestures reminded me that not everyone had forgotten, that some still remembered why we were there. But those whispers were drowned out by the louder cheers, and it was those louder voices that defined the room. As the hours passed, I became quieter, more withdrawn. I listened to the laughter, the endless chatter about his bright future, and felt the weight of disappointment settle heavier on my shoulders. I wasn't angry at my brother, I couldn't be, because his achievement was real and deserved to be recognized. What hurt was how easily people had allowed my moment to dissolve, how quickly the narrative of the day had been rewritten without me at the center. It was as though my story had been paused, waiting in the shadows, while his story took the stage. Inside, I whispered silent promises to myself, gripping the thought that one day my child would know they had been celebrated, even if the world had overlooked it in that moment. I told myself that the love I carried, the sacrifices I made, the journey I was walking, those things couldn't be erased by one overshadowed party. But even with those reassurances, the ache of being sidelined lingered, heavy and unshakable, a quiet reminder that my day had slipped from my hands and turned into something entirely different. In the quiet corners of my mind, I began to reflect on what this day had truly revealed to me about family dynamics and the way recognition plays such a powerful role in shaping our sense of worth. As I sat there, watching the energy swirl around my brother, I realized how fragile moments of celebration can be, how quickly they can shift depending on whose story feels louder or more impressive in the eyes of others. I had expected my baby shower to be a moment where my identity as a mother-to-be would be honored, where the life growing inside me would feel like the center of everyone's joy. Instead, I found myself confronting the reality that sometimes even the most personal milestones can be eclipsed when those around us don't realize the importance of holding space for them. I thought about how families often assign roles, whether consciously or not. My brother had always been the achiever, the one whose accomplishments were celebrated loudly, whose successes were retold like family legends at gatherings. I, on the other hand, had often been seen as steady, dependable, but rarely the star of the story. Sitting there, I couldn't help but feel that the baby shower had only reinforced that unspoken dynamic. He had once again become the one celebrated, while I was left holding on to a quieter, less visible form of significance. It stung not because I wanted to compete, but because I wanted, just once, for my moment to stand on its own without being overshadowed. The recognition I longed for wasn't about applause or admiration in the same way his announcement had received. It was about being seen for the transformation I was undergoing, for the vulnerability and strength it took to step into motherhood. Carrying a child was not a certificate you could hang on the wall or a letter you could frame, but it was no less profound. I wished those around me could understand that my journey, though different, was worthy of just as much acknowledgement. I wanted them to see that the quiet work of preparing to become a mother was an achievement in itself, one that deserved to be honored with as much pride as any acceptance letter. In those moments of reflection, I found myself turning inward, asking why it mattered so deeply to me to be recognized. Perhaps it was because I wanted reassurance that I wasn't invisible, that the love and effort I had already poured into this child were valued. Perhaps it was because I wanted my baby to know, even before they arrived, that they were worthy of being celebrated wholeheartedly, without distraction. More than anything, I wanted to feel that my role in bringing life into the world carried a weight that others acknowledged, not just something taken for granted because it was less glamorous than academic success. As I looked around the room, I saw faces lit with excitement, voices rising with energy, and I realized that sometimes people don't mean to overshadow us, they simply don't notice when they do. Their joy for my brother wasn't malicious, it was genuine pride for him. Yet the absence of balance, the inability to hold two celebrations at once, revealed something deeper about how easily moments of significance can be stolen without anyone realizing it. That recognition made me pause, not just in hurt, but in contemplation about how often this pattern plays out in families, where one person's story consistently drowns out another's. The sidelining I experienced that day planted questions in me about how I wanted to navigate family dynamics moving forward. I thought about how I would raise my own child, how I would ensure they felt seen and celebrated in their own right, no matter who else was shining at the same time. I promised myself, even in silence, that I would teach my child the importance of holding space for others, of recognizing that joy is not diminished when it is shared, that one person's moment does not have to erase another's. That promise became a quiet strength inside me, a way to turn my hurt into something that could guide me in motherhood. I also began to see the importance of speaking up, of claiming my own space rather than waiting for others to hand it to me. Part of the reason I felt sidelined was because I stayed silent, too worried about appearing ungrateful or selfish to remind people that this day was meant for me. That silence echoed louder than I expected, leaving me with a sense of regret for not asserting my place. In the future, I knew I would need to find the courage to say, "This is my moment too," not to diminish someone else's joy, but to protect my own. As the evening went on, I watched the decorations I had chosen cast shadows on the walls, watched the gifts sit quietly waiting to be opened, and I realized that the meaning of the day had shifted inside me. It was no longer just about balloons and cake, or even about being surrounded by family. It had become a lesson about visibility, about what it feels like to be overlooked, and about the importance of claiming recognition when it matters most. That reflection settled deep within me, reminding me that even when others fail to see the significance of your journey, it does not make it any less important.